Hello, everyone. This is Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So, in talking with my audience in one of my other shows, my other videos earlier this morning, the conversation came up about games, specifically war games. So, I'm playing this game, XCOM. Somebody else, I think I was talking about Civ earlier. Somebody mentioned this war of mine. Now, this war of mine doesn't take the standpoint of war as if you're the conqueror and everything else. It takes the standpoint of people who are living through the hell and the chaos that those people who tend to want to be conquerors enact upon the world. It's a gritty game. I'm going to show this game, and I just want to make a point at the end of it. This is short. I think it's like 3 minutes. And it's going to give this thing of the grittiness associated with being in a war zone. The situations that you find yourself in, the grittiness, the grit, the horror. People just trying to survive. And the situations that those people end up in and just trying to survive. The moral ambiguities, the consequences. Just taking actions just to live. The negative consequences for somebody else just for you trying to make a living in that war zone. I'm going to show it and then I'm going to talk about it after. This is a relatively short clip. I think it's about 3 minutes. And we'll discuss in a few.
Time survival game from 11-bit studios. Games can be ridiculously reductive portrayals of complex problems. Everything is eventually solvable via learning and repetition. And what games can sometimes unwittingly teach you is that bad things don't happen to good people, or smart people, or hardworking people. They happen to people who did the wrong thing at the wrong time, but everything would have been just fine if you just played the system a little bit better. What I love about this war of mine is that it never lets you forget that the world doesn't actually work that way. War doesn't work that way. As you try and lead a group of survivors during an unnamed conflict by scavenging for items, jury-rigging survival aids like heaters and vegetable gardens, and bartering with other survivors for goods, you might occasionally feel like you're getting the hang of wartime survival. But then the game reminds you, in shockingly effective and heartbreaking fashion, that in war, all your planning is nothing next to the chaos and cruelty that surrounds you. But this war of mine wouldn't be half as good as it is if it weren't also an effective survival game. It's divided into 2 phases. By day, you do chores around your shelter, building new items, harvesting and filtering rainwater, and cooking food for your characters. By night, you go scavenging around the city in a tense, atmospheric 2D stealth game. While some locations are abandoned looters' playgrounds, the war-torn city features a lot of other unsavory types. Soldiers and militia might be willing to trade with you or ignore you, but they can turn on you in a heartbeat. Other survivors might shoot you on sight. Rummaging through a pile of rubble sends sound waves far into the distance, alerting people to your presence. But things get especially tricky because your survivors don't just care about surviving. They're civilians, they're ordinary people. They care about how they survive. They have ethical lines that they won't cross, or if you do cross them, then there's going to be an emotional cost. I'll give you an example. In one game, I had this character, Roman, who was an ex-soldier who had deserted when the horrors of war became too much for him. He was the only one of my survivors who was a trained fighter, so when one of my scavengers was shot and nearly killed by some paranoid survivors guarding their home, I sent Roman back the next night with an assault rifle and a knife. I admit I overreacted, but I figured...
Now, the funny part to this, he says, I admit I overreacted, and I thought to myself, no, that's an appropriate reaction to take. Now, the reason I said that's an appropriate reaction, because if you were in a group and you had somebody in your group that you cared about that got killed, what is your reaction going to be? Your reaction is probably going to be what that guy did. Now, assume for the moment that that person wasn't necessarily being played by a character, and assume for the moment that person was real in the game space. Assume for the moment that person had, to some degree, some measure of consciousness, but he had no idea where his decisions were coming from. Assume for the moment he was kind of like us. And assume in that moment, in anger and rage, he was pissed off and he went to actually go and kill those people who killed his friend. Let's take a listen at what takes place later. This is fucking amazing.
Hey, these people nearly killed one of mine, so we're going to kill one of theirs, and then we're going to take their medical supplies for our trouble. So that's what Roman did. He stabbed one of them who was standing guard, and then he shot and killed their sniper. Then he stepped over the last survivor who was just weeping over the corpses of her friends, and he grabbed all their medicine and food and took it back to our party, took it back to our shelter. It all worked well, except that Roman was emotionally destroyed by that night. He came back to the shelter the next morning and just collapsed. He couldn't be moved. He wouldn't work, couldn't go out scavenging. He just sat there, and his morale state had changed to broken. And the rest of the party started to get depressed as well. And suddenly, just like that, we were in a death spiral. We had the supplies we needed to survive, but nobody really wanted to. They were all horrified by what Roman had done, and by extension, I guess, what they had done, and the toll it took on all of them. Without the booze, coffee, and cigarettes that made the boring, depressing life of a survivor bearable, they couldn't recover. There was no way to sort of restore the equilibrium. So one by one, they all fell into depression and despair. Roman left. Another person just stayed in bed and wouldn't get up. And slowly, we went right back to starving. Tailspins like that mean that you'll end up replaying this war of mine a lot. So it's good that there's so much variation between playthroughs. The same locations are reset.
What I'm fascinated about with this game, and I guess the topic of this, or the thing that I want to talk about, is your value system and your morality. Your morality is ultimately tethered to where you are. What does a Starfleet officer look like in a war zone? Starfleet officer in a war zone looks like everyone else in a war zone. They're just trying to survive. The ideas, the morality, and the highfalutin, morality of the Starfleet officer and everything else. And I'm using Starfleet only from the standpoint, we're talking about a game, and I'm using this from the standpoint of the evolved human in this way. That evolved human is only evolved because he has a society that allows him to be evolved. They've instilled certain things in him. They've extracted other things, meaning they don't necessarily have this idea of war and torture and killing like we have in our society. Yes, and eventually it came back to the society and they were fighting Dominion. But that wasn't from the people within the Federation itself. That was external to the Federation. They were fighting off a threat. It wasn't something that they were... I guess what I'm saying is their civilization had achieved peace. Earth had unified. Earth wasn't warlike. Earth, for all intents and purposes, from our standpoint, was a utopia. There is no such thing as utopia, but from Earth standards. From our standards, it's fucking marvelous. I guess what I'm saying is, when we're looking from the standpoint of the United States, our cities haven't been bombed. Our cities haven't been destroyed. You may say 9/11, but 9/11 was a once-off. We're not talking about something where people are continuously destroying one city after the next after the next. But that is what we do, and we do it casually. We go drone bombing, killing people's mother, sister, cousin, brother, and we don't bat an eye about it. We go in, eat our Cheerios, we go on to our affairs. Do you realize we were sending troops and weapons into the Syria thing in order to keep that war prolonged, keep it kind of a meat grinder, bubbling over, because we didn't necessarily want to get fully involved in Syria, but by the same token, we wanted Bashar al-Assad to leave. So Obama couldn't make up his mind. Donald Trump comes in office and ends up with doing the exact same policy, regardless of him saying how much he wants to get out of those countries. We don't see the toll that stuff takes on other people when we engage in behaviors in this way. And praising these presidents as if these are good people and everything else when these people are committing horrors and atrocities abroad is one of the failings of the media in this country. We don't see it. We don't see the toll. We see every so often CNN going and sniffing somebody's book bag looking for a chemical agent. But CNN doesn't necessarily get across what we do in those countries that promotes certain behaviors in those countries. We like to say, oh, those people just never get it together, missing the fact that we helped overturn Iran, the previous person in Iran. The country was a secular country. We put in a dictator, and now they overthrew that person, and that ended up being this kind of theocratic government. Oh, we hate the government now. We're okay with the theocratic government of Saudi Arabia that spreads terrorism throughout the world, but we hate the Iranian government. When we overturn and put a dictator in the country, God damn it, that dictator better stay in that country. Same thing with Iraq. Iraq had gotten to the point where one of the guys who overturned one of the governments in Iraq had this egalitarian country that he was implementing, but he wasn't going to give us the oil, in which case it was a problem. So Western forces, just like they're doing in Libya, or just like they did in Libya, just like they're doing in Syria, backed the Ba'ath Party. This eventually gets around to backing Saddam Hussein, who of course becomes, according to Bush, a monster But Bush always leaves out the fact that he was our monster at one point. We've been meddling in the Middle East for years, radicalizing elements in Afghanistan so they can be more vicious against the Russians. We've been meddling in those countries for years, and we completely miss the impact of what we do in those countries when we create those countries to be war zones. Here's the thing. The point I want to make is, and I'm going to leave it at this. For all your ideals, all of the things and the virtues that people think they have, those things are completely tethered and dependent upon the society that you're in. If that society goes, your values go with it. And I know that sounds harsh, but it is true. In this particular game, either you die or you make certain decisions that is going to adversely affect somebody else. Do you steal the person's food from the elderly couple that's crying when you're taking their food away from them and they're begging you not to take their food and medication? Or do you let your friends starve? Which one do you take? Which one is right? I mean, you might say from where you are with a full stomach that, well, look, I would never take somebody's food in that way. But the reality of the situation is you haven't had the pang of hunger. You haven't been crawling over dead bodies. You haven't had these shitty situations that you've had to deal with where you've finally been pushed down and devolved to the point of saying, yes, okay. You're a used car salesman. And I've used this analogy because I like to make this analogy because I think this makes a good point. You're a used car salesman. You know the car is lemon. A couple comes in, maybe a mom, maybe a kid, whoever. You know that car as a flat fact is a lemon and that thing is going to fall out in about 30 to 60 days. You have a wife at home. You have a kid at home. You guys are barely making ends meet. Do you let that kid starve and you not sell that lemon, or do you sell that lemon? I would guarantee you that the majority of people will sell that lemon and they would find it to be the moral choice, even though they would go home and feel shitty about themselves for doing it. Your morality is nice, but your morality is somewhat of a trinket of the environment that you're in. Worse environments, and that morality is going to go away as you struggle to survive. We should show the horrors of war. It should be required reading. We shouldn't hide it away from kids. We shouldn't hide it away from anybody else. When bodies are coming back, we should show those bodies. When we're in classrooms and as children, we should show the horrors of what war has done. We should show the horrors of the conditions that people live in those wars. We should show it all. They should not be hiding this type of information. Putting the flags over the coffin so you can't... Nonsense. You should show it. Public should see it. Otherwise, they have no way to understand the gravity of the events that they themselves are rah-rahing for in this way. I'll leave it at that. This has gone far too long. Morality is dependent on the environment, not the other way around. That's my point. And one of the things that this game nails home is that very specific point, which is why I'm showing this particular video. Good looking out, Joshua, for giving me a heads up. I've seen this game before. It was a gaming video that gave me the hint of this game. And I was like, oh my God, I have to relook that up. And when Joshua Renshaw gave me the heads up, I was like, oh, I remember what that was. I'm supposed to be looking that game up. Good looking out, Joshua, for the heads up. So, this war of mine, I think I'm probably going to be getting this game. And you know what? I would even be interested in playing this game online with the audience, if the audience even cares about stuff like that. So, just let me know. I used to play Blitz online or chess online. I think the people are less disengaged in something like that. But something like Civ or something like this, I think people will be more engaged in because they can add in what they think is right, what they think people should do, what they think is the right responses. In some cases, there's not going to be a right response. And you can have people arguing in the chat itself on what they think is right and all this other stuff. I think that would be an interesting thing to try. Yeah, just let me know if you're interested. That's assuming anybody even sees this video. But if you think you're interested in something like that, let me know. So, all right, guys. I will leave it at that. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe, and of course, you guys can always support the Patreon. Thanks, everyone.